Hello, welcome to this module where we will be looking at lymphatic and immune systems. On this video, our focus will be on the general aspects of the lymphatic system and lymphoid organs and tissues. As you might remember from our earlier discussions, all body systems are linked to each other, and this is going to be the case also here. In this case, it is especially the cardiovascular system, the vascular part of it, so the blood vessels, that overlaps with the lymphatic system and also the immune system. This is a good place for us to look at this system at this stage of the course. And the clinical relevance for us is, of course, the checking of lymph nodes, both for swelling and their sensitivity. It is one of the first tests that the doctor does when you go in with a complaint of feeling sick, having a cold, and so on. So what happens is that the doctor will likely test your lymph nodes and evaluate whether they are abnormal in size and if they are sensitive to the touch. If you show signs of both of these, this would be indicative of an infection. So, in order for us to be able to evaluate if something is abnormal in size or more sensitive than normally, we need to, of course, first know the normal anatomy and physiology. So that's what we are trying to do and get to know here. So why don't we get started? I think that we should start by discussing what is it that lymphatic system really aims to do. But to understand this, we need to first take a step further back. Remember when in our unit of the cardiovascular system, we talked about capillaries being the site of exchange of materials. These very small vessels had a very thin wall so that this exchange would be very efficient. And remember also that we had two pressures acting here. Hydrostatic pressure, which pushed outwards from the vessel, and osmotic pressure, which was the force pushing back into the vessel. So let's look at this a little more by zooming into what happens. So here we see these two forces working on a level of capillary microcirculation. And if you remember that a human circulatory system passed through some 20 liters of blood each day, you will notice that it all has to pass through this area. And the term that we will use to describe what happens here is capillary filtration. This refers to the movement of fluids across the capillary membranes. And you are already familiar with the term plasma. It is plasma that moves through these capillaries walls into a space outside them, and is a space that is left outside the cells. This plasma is now in this space outside the vascular system of the blood, which we just talked about. And what is interesting is to look at the numbers for me. So let's do just that. In a day, about 20 liters of plasma leaks out. Please know that I use the term leak very loosely here. It is actually meant to leave the capillaries into this space outside the vasculature. And about 17 liters of this is reabsorbed back into the blood vessels. So a simple math exercise shows us that remaining 3 liters becomes now this interstitial fluid, which is left to this space. And it is these 3 liters of fluid that the lymphatic system deals with, picking it up from this space, taking it into the lymphatic vessels, and returning back to the cardiovascular system's blood vessels. So we have now seen a couple of terms that I want to be sure that we are certain about, and especially what term is used at which point. First, we have blood in the vasculature of the cardiovascular system. This traveled to the capillaries, and once it escaped outside them, it became interstitial fluid. And this 3 liters of net gain of the fluid that is left outside is bound to become lymph. But when does it become lymph? Well, the answer is that when it enters the lymphatic system through entering the lymphatic vessels. Well, back to this slide. What I want to do next is to discuss why we should tackle the lymphatic and immune system together. Let's have a look at that. So, lymphatic system and immune system are linked, as lymphoid organs and tissues provide the structures for the immune system to work in. Immune system's phagocytotic cells and lymphocytes are housed within the lymphatic system structures. And the last thing for us to do is to consider the different parts of the lymphatic system. So we will cover the network of lymphatic vessels, the fluid in these vessels known as the lymph, and the lymph nodes. These clean the lymph. So that sounds like a good plan of action for me for this chapter. So you might remember a diagram that is similar to this, as you saw something like it during our discussion on the cardiovascular system. Here we see a representation of systemic circuit. Note how it is a closed loop where the blood can travel only to one direction. And it was at the side of the capillaries where some of the content sneaked out and some of it was recovered, and the remaining part became interstitial fluid. Now, this interstitial fluid needs to be picked up by the lymphatic system. So let's add that to this diagram. And here we have the lymphatic system added to this diagram. You might notice how it is open from one end, the end where it picks up the interstitial fluid around the blood capillaries. So this is not a closed system like blood circulation, but rather an open one. And another thing to note is that it dumps its contents that it carries. And this was lymph, of course. This is emptied back to the cardiovascular system just before the heart. And finally, please note that this system as well is unidirectional. So lymph can travel only one direction in it. So there we have a rather nice comparison of the lymphatic system and cardiovascular system. Now let's look in a little more detail the lymphatic vessels. So just like we had in blood vessels, there are different sized lymphatic vessels. And also note the order in which I am presenting these. This is not a coincidence. We always discuss these, like the blood vessels, in the order of flow of the content in it. So, lymphatic capillaries are located between blood vessels capillaries and the cells that make these tissues of that area. If you compare them to the blood vessel capillaries, they have largely similar structures. But the big thing here is that they are more permeable. And another thing that will be important for us to note is that they can take in much larger elements than the blood capillaries. This can be both good and bad. Many large proteins are able to cross into the body in this way, and we will talk about the role of the lymphatic system in absorbing these from a nutritional standpoint as it relates to the transportation of large fat molecules that are too big to cross into the capillaries of the blood vessels. But more detail on this will be covered in a later unit. And also cell fragments get taken up to the circulatory system and then transported in this way. Where this becomes problematic, though, is, for example, if we try to remove a cancerous tumor and some of these cancer cells get into the lymphatic system. Once within the lymphatic system, they can spread throughout the entire body. So this is why some prefer treatment options where the growth is not cut into. And of course, another example of a problem is when pathogens manage to enter the lymphatic system and they can use it as a route to spread to almost all parts of the body. Well, lymphatic capillaries then drain into larger lymphatic vessels. And these are increasingly larger and are known as collecting lymphatic vessels. And again, we have the same order of structures as in blood vessels. Collecting vessels, trunks, and eventually ducts. In these, we have the same structures that resemble those on the veins of the blood vessels. The big difference is that there are much more valves and more connections to other lymphatic vessels. So let's have a look at some of the lymphatic vessels in situ. These are some especially important ones for us to know. What we see here is a view inside the thoracic cavity. And just to give us some anatomical landmarks that we probably are familiar with, let's note that we see here esophagus and trachea. So our tube for taking the food to the stomach located behind the windpipe. And based on what we just learned about the cardiovascular system, we might note superior and inferior vena cava. So these major veins bring blood into the heart. And on this picture, both of these vessels, as well as the trachea and esophagus, they are all cut in order to allow us to see the other structures behind. The ones that I want to highlight, especially regarding our lymphatic system, are the thoracic duct, which we will talk a bit more in a moment, and a structure called cisterna chyli. This is a dilated sac at the lower end of the thoracic duct, so a rather nice anatomical landmark. So let's return back to this review of different types of lymphatic vessels that we may have, and I want us to this time focus on the lymphatic trunks. And what I have for us next here is a very nice diagram. So let's study it in a little more detail. But first, I want to remind us that lymphatic trunks are larger than the structures that we have looked earlier. These are formed by vessels joining together. And here is where this diagram comes in useful for us. These trunks are named based on the body region. So we have lumbar region at the lower part of the back, and intestinal trunk at the intestines. Remember the term intercostal, where intercostal trunks are located between the ribs. Now, let's look at bronchomediastinal lymphatic trunk. That's quite a mouthful of a term, but if we break it down, we will see that the name actually tells well where this term refers to the trunks at the bronchi and mediastinum. A few more that I want to mention. Subclavian trunk is below the clavicle, so below our collarbone if you wish. And finally, jugular trunk. Well, this is at the level of the neck and throat. So I think that this is quite a nice diagram for us to have had a look of. Now, let's move on to have a look of the lymphatic ducts. These are even larger in size. And we will have a look of the two most important ones. First, right lymphatic duct. This drains the right arm and right side of the head and thorax, and it empties to the right subclavian vein. And then we have thoracic duct, which we talked earlier on a bit. You might remember this figure from what we saw earlier, and I promised to get back to it. So, thoracic duct drains the remaining parts of the body, and it empties into the left subclavian. I think we should take a little step and talk about clinical relevance here. So I wanted to introduce the term lymphedema. And this is where there's too much lymph building up, and it is not drained by the lymphatic vessels as it should be. And some examples of causes include tumors blocking the lymphatic vessels or removal of lymphatic vessels during cancer surgery. And the future outcome may not be that gloomy if some of the lymphatic pathways have remained on that area and they end up enlarging to compensate for the loss of other vessels from the site. Let's have a look at some of the examples of it. So if you look at these examples, you will see that there is a significant swelling on only one side. And this swelling is due to the lymphatic drainage being compromised on this area. So lymph builds up. This asymmetry is a good clue here. And before we wrap up this video, I think that we should address a few other points. And the first one is something that I think that we have not yet covered properly and is very important. We have not really talked about what the lymph itself is made of. Well, lymph contains all of these, which of course, water being where all others are dissolved in. And then we have proteins and white blood cells, of course. One thing to note here is that there should not be any red blood cells in lymph. And where is the lymph produced then? Well, at the bone marrow and lymph nodes. And we will have a look of the lymph nodes especially in a little more detail in the next video. Finally, let's look at the lymphoid cells in a little more detail. So lymphoid cells consist of immune system cells, which are found in lymphoid tissue, and supporting cells that form lymphoid tissue structures. We will start with the immune system cells. Well, these are known as lymphocytes and are cells of the adaptive immune system which then mature into one of the two main types, T cells, which are T lymphocytes, and B cells, which are then B lymphocytes. Both T and B cells protect us against anything that body might perceive as foreign. And if we want to have a look of these in a little more detail, T cells manage immune response, and some of these also attach and destroy infected cells, while B cells produce plasma cells which secrete antibodies. And these antibodies mark antigens for destruction. And we can also have other lymphoid immune cells such as macrophages and dendritic cells. Then let's say just a few words about supporting lymphoid cells. Well, reticular cells produce reticular fibers called stroma in lymphoid organs. These are a network-like support that acts as a scaffolding for immune cells. And you can see a good example of this in the figure that I have provided. So that's it for our first video on the lymphatic system. We will continue in the next video with a bit more detailed look into the lymphatic tissues. I look forward to seeing you then.